They believe that there were issues with the way that the election was conducted. And what I believe happened is that they saw that if they did change the bylaw, it would require a 2/3 majority in order to remove me, instead of a simple majority that they could do just through simply saying there was an issue with the election and then redoing it. And ultimately, when it came down to that, I decided not to run for re-election because we have bigger things to focus on right now than a ceremonial volunteer role at the DNC or a title there, when I'm going to do the work that I believe we need to do to win back young people, which is supporting people like Zoran.
All right, joining us now is David Hogg. He is leader of Leaders We Deserve. He was, of course, co-founder of March for Our Lives, and I think a lot of you know about his past. He was also vice chair of the DNC, and we're, of course, going to talk about that a little bit as well. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Cenk. How are you?
Good, brother. How you doing?
You know, just dealing with the creeping authoritarianism and seeing the horrific stuff that happened to Kat today with the indictment.
Yeah, indeed. So we got a lot to talk about. First, we'll get to your brief era at the DNC. I'm very curious about that, right? But I want people to know about Leaders We Deserve first, and then at the end we'll probably talk about the candidates. But so what is the point of the group?
The point of the group is to help elect more people just like Maxwell Frost. I got started out helping out him in his congressional race, and with his campaign manager, we saw how hard it was for him to run for office. He was 24 years old at the time when he was running. He was running against 2 former members of Congress, one of whom had run a hedge fund while being a member of Congress, and the other had committed tax fraud while being a member of Congress, both of whom were Democrats. And the reason why Maxwell is the right person for that race wasn't just because he was young necessarily, it's because he had the right experience and he wasn't corrupt as hell. He had worked in the gun safety movement since he was 15 years old, advocating with survivors from Sandy Hook and other instances of gun violence at state legislatures and in Congress to strengthen gun laws. He'd done work with the ACLU as well to hold President Biden accountable on the Hyde Amendment to get him to change his stance on it. So we saw how hard it was for him to get elected. And once he was elected, we thought it was amazing, but we needed more people like him to be in Congress, to be in state legislatures. So we created Leaders We Deserve to kind of be like an Emily's List for young Democrats, young progressive Democrats running for state legislature and Congress who don't take corporate money. What I'd like to say is we're like a lumbar support for candidates with a spine, where we come in and we'll spend a substantial amount of money in races on the order of several $100,000 to $1 million+ in some instances to get candidates across the finish line, and not just give them money, but give them advice on a day-to-day basis, make sure that their finances are in order, make sure that they are doing everything they can to get local endorsements, build the right field program, and make sure that we're kind of standing up to be not a special interest, but help stand for the people's interests. So candidates can actually stand for what their constituents want and not special interests.
So David, a couple of groups now are progressive and don't take corporate PAC money, including Just Democrats as an example. Yep. So is the distinction here that you're mainly helping younger candidates?
Yeah, so I would say the difference with us and Justice Democrats, although we do collaborate on some races like Justin Pearson or Donovan McKinney, both of whom are challenging incumbent Democrats in safe Democratic seats, is we work a lot at the state legislative level. That's about the cycle where half of our work is going to end up being. And on top of that, we work obviously in red to blue races too, because we want to help win back the House. So there is some overlap with groups like Justice Democrats, but a lot of our work is especially in state legislatures, in states that the party is largely written off because they think that it's not going to flip immediately or is not worth investing in. States like Texas, states like North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and others that we know that we're going to need to start really having a bench in, an infrastructure in, to have a pathway to 270 electoral votes after the 2030 redistricting and census reapportionment that happens, where states like California are going to lose several electoral votes and congressional districts. Meanwhile, states like Texas, Utah, Arizona, and Florida are going to gain several congressional districts and electoral votes. So we're trying to invest right now in the young people that are building real networks in those states. And this weekend, I'm actually going to be traveling to two of those states in the South to support our candidates. I'm going to Houston, Texas to support Christian Menifee in his special election out there for Congress. And I'm going to Atlanta, Georgia to support our candidate, Akbar Ali, who will be 21. And then I'm going to New York to support Zoran, who we were the largest financial contributor to in his super PAC, in support of him, giving them $300,000 in the final weeks in the lead up to the campaign. And one thing that I also urge people to understand about us is that our funding model is not like a lot of groups that are out there. We're not funded by just a couple extraordinarily wealthy people. We're funded by 220,000 individual donors around the country that support us. And that enables us to have something that many groups can't, which is independence. After we supported Zoran, Cenk, there were two major donors that called me up that had offered several $100,000 in support, or had given over $100,000 in support before, and said, we're not going to support you anymore because you supported Zoran. But because the vast majority of our support comes from small dollar donors, that means that the organization's work continues, even though those donors don't necessarily agree with a candidate like Zoran, because he wants to, if they don't agree with him on any number of issues, from taxing the wealthy more to Israel or anything like that. Because we're not here to just do the work of what the donor class wants. We're here to be, like I said, the people's interest, there instead of a special interest.
Donors on behalf of Israel pulling their funding depending on whether a candidate supports Israel or not. But I'm sure that does not affect Congress at all, or any of our politicians. Okay, anyways, so now let's go to your time at the DNC. Before we get into the kind of controversies, what are
you talking about?
What was the thing that you learned inside the DNC that you were surprised by?
A thing that I learned inside of the DNC that I was surprised by. Because I think how many people do not understand what the DNC actually does, in comparison to what they think it does a lot of the time. I think there's a lot of people, who think that who mix up the DNC with party committees, for example, like the DS that helps with Senate campaigns and supporting Democrats there, or the DCCC that helps with US House races, or the DLCC that helps with state legislative races. And those things are not the same, right? The Democratic National Committee's job is essentially to be the presidential campaign in waiting. It's to manage the voter file. It's to help raise money for local and state parties, and to help manage the debate schedule and platform of the party. It doesn't have that much of a role, or really any, in these Senate races or in these congressional House races or anything like that. So I think that's the main thing. In addition, I think that everybody wants the DNC to be, they all have their own idea of what the DNC should be doing or what it should be. The problem is there's really two roles that people are trying to make it be at the same time. Everybody wants it to be like a coach for the party, to be the organization that helps support the candidates that they want to see more of in the Democratic Party. And then there's the other side of that, where some people believe that it should just be like a referee in the party, of managing primaries and supporting just the general infrastructure of the party. The problem is, if everybody wants the DNC to be like a coach for their version of what they believe Democrats can be, that's great, but everybody has a different idea of what that can be, and it's kind of impossible to do that.
So you're worried that people want them to be a coach, and it's too hard to do that. That's interesting. Okay,
in some sense, it's like it's just that it's not just that though. It's that in order to gain power inside of the DNC for somebody like Ken Martin, to become the chair of the DNC, a lot of the time it is just determined by essentially how long you've known a lot of people and what type of relationships you have with them. It's not determined necessarily by, well, who's the most charismatic person on TV, or who is the person that has the best messaging necessarily for the party. It's very insular. It's about, what is your relationship like with 450 members of the DNC? And ultimately, when you're somebody like Ken Martin and you have all those relationships over the course of 8 years, because you've been the chair of the state Democratic Party chairs, you're going to have a lot more relationships than somebody like Ben Winkler, who was going out there, going on TV and getting a lot of public support, obviously. But there's a fundamental disconnect between what the individuals inside of the establishment of the party, like the DNC members, want, versus what the general public believes that we should have in a chair of the DNC, for example.
Well, so that leads perfectly into the question that I wanted to ask you next, which is, how did you win the vice chair position? Because and were you surprised given the dynamic you just described?
I think I won because of ageism. ironically, in some senses. I think that people really assumed that I did not know what I was doing. And it was, I was able to catch them by surprise because what I did is I asked people for their advice. And I asked them, what do I need to do to win this? And they said, just call every single DNC member, because they give you a list of them nonstop, basically, until you get an answer from them, and ask them, what can you do to earn their support? And look, there was actually somebody who, when I ran the first time, the first call that I made when I decided to run, I had never talked to this person before, and they supported, it was actually a younger person who is part of like the youth infrastructure of the Democratic Party, that I called to ask for their support. And what this person said to me was, David, let's be honest here. I know you don't know me, we've never talked before, but this is a bad idea. You cannot win. There's no pathway to victory, and you should not be doing this. And what I learned from that process, what I practiced was some of the tactics that I learned actually talking to people who are often armed and vehemently disagree with me, that are armed counter protesters outside of different public events and things that I did or do. And what I said to them is like, I respect that you don't agree with me, but I still care a lot about obviously supporting younger people in the Democratic Party. So I would love to stay in touch with you and get your advice and get your thoughts, because I genuinely wanted it, even if they weren't supporting me. And as I continued talking to that person, and I racked up more endorsements, Tim Walz ended up endorsing me. And you'll never believe who called me immediately after Tim Walz endorsed me and said, oh my God, this is so great. What can I do to support you? And I think what I did through the process is, even though people at times were rude to me, or wrote me off, or thought that I just never would do it, I just kept my head down and did the work and stayed focused on earning people's support, even if they initially didn't support me, because I didn't take it personally. I knew I had a lot to prove as a young person, as somebody who had never been that super active in a state Democratic Party or anything like that. But what I saw was an opportunity for me to be the change that I wanted to see. At the first meeting of the DNC that I ever went to, or the first executive meeting I ever went to prior to being elected, when I was considering running for the position, it was the first executive committee meeting they had after the presidential election, and they were reviewing why did we lose. The first thing they brought up was our pollster at the DNC brought up was 18 to 29-year-old voters. And I looked at this table of about, I think it was 40 people on this committee, and I didn't see a single one of them that was under the age of 35 on the committee. And I saw an opportunity for me to be the change that I wanted to see. And when I ran, I said, I'm not going to change my values, and I'm going to tell people what they believe they need to hear and not just what they want to hear. And I genuinely thought it was very likely that I would not win, but I was going to give it my best and do everything that I could to get across that finish line. And I think because of the fact that I was 24 years old, many people thought that I just could not do it. But because I put my head down, I did the work, and they underestimated me, I ended up being able to win in that position. And then they decided to redo the election later on, when I said, we need to challenge some older members of Congress and get some fresh blood in the party. But that's a story for your next question, I'm sure.
Yeah, almost there. What you're describing sounds like a lot of the voting members of the DNC sound pretty conservative. I don't know if I mean that perfectly politically, certainly by a matter of nature, and maybe even politically. So am I hearing that right?
Some of them certainly are more conservative. I had some very interesting conversations at times with more conservative Democrats in our party. But what I will say is, surprisingly, the first Democratic Party, that state party that endorsed me as a whole, was actually North Dakota. There were a lot of red states that supported me early on. Chair Gina Repass in Kansas was incredibly supportive of me through the process and heavily encouraged me to run. This is not to say that certainly all or even most of the DNC members are ageist by any means, and I want to be clear about that. But there were actually a lot of people who were supportive of me, even though I had obviously was a progressive, and there are progressives that are DNC members as well. And God bless them. It is not an easy role to be in, but certainly some of them are more conservative, I will say that much. But I think the bigger thing that I realized while I was running is, I think there's a lot of people in our party who frankly don't even really know what they believe in, other than what they believe will help them get on a better committee or help them get on into some higher position. And I think that's a big mistake that we make as Democrats. I think that people assume that if you kind of just compromise on your values, that you can exchange that for power, when in fact, I think it's the exact opposite. I think that when you compromise on your values, you are actually giving up on your power. Look at somebody like Zoran, right? If he compromised his values when he was polling at 1% in order to start polling better and then get to the position he's in now, sure, he would win. But ultimately, who is really winning if he did compromise his values? It wouldn't be him. It would be the people he was compromising towards.
Yeah. So at this late date, though, you're saying there's still there's some, but not a lot of progressives at the DNC.
Certainly, and if they speak out, obviously there are time. Every state committee, state parties have different rules in terms of how they get elected and everything, and then get into those positions. But I think part of the challenge, to be honest with you, and this is not to give the DNC a free pass by any means, but part of the challenge is that think about if you're in Ken Martin's position, right? Or any of the vice chair's positions. If there's something that the party or more specifically Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries are doing that you don't agree with, you can't really speak out against it, because if you do, it's like, okay, what does it matter? They are that's the Speaker of the House, the minority Speaker of the House, and then you have somebody like Chuck Schumer as the minority leader, and it's ultimately it creates this kind of disconnect where it's like, yeah, you have this title, you have this position, but ultimately you don't actually have the power that goes along with it to be able to dictate what Democrats in Congress are actually doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does a little bit. And I think Ken Martin's often caught in tough situations. So that leads me to the next question, which is you put him in a little bit of a tough situation. And I'm very curious about this one. Not the second time when they actually ousted you, but the first issue that came up was, hey, listen, you're running this PAC, Leaders We Deserve, that we talked about. And we want the DNC to be neutral, which is a rule that I like and is a rule that progressives originally came up with. And I thought that was a bit of a fair criticism. So what do you make of that?
Well, what I'll say about that is when I ran to be a vice chair of the DNC, I read the bylaws to understand, could I even do this in terms of having a PAC that works in primaries when I was a vice chair of the DNC. And I looked at the people who were vice chairs previously, people like Gretchen Whitmer and Tammy Duckworth, both of whom had PACs. And when I read the bylaws, it said that it didn't say anything about you not being able to be involved in primaries other than the presidential, because that really is what the DNC has control over, is the presidential primary. And then the fact of the matter is as well that the DNC does give money to groups like the DCCC and the DS, who famously, as you just saw with Graham, I'm sure in your interview mentioned this, the DS does get involved in primaries and does have their candidates. And my argument was, if you're going to remain totally neutral, and I'll tell you what I said to Ken. I said, look, if you want to change this bylaw, I don't believe that you should set the precedent that you can change the bylaw that then results in one of your officers like myself being outside of the lines of that bylaw. So what if we met in the middle and you passed this and I supported it, so long as you added in a grandfather clause? Because I understand the philosophy behind wanting to have all officers of the DNC remain neutral, but I just don't believe that we should set the precedent of being able to change the bylaws that then results in an officer all of a sudden being outside of the lines when if they were elected, they weren't previously, if that makes sense. But ultimately what happened is they decided that there was issues, I'll say conveniently, but that they believed that there were issues with the way that the election was conducted. And what I believe happened is that they saw that if they did change the bylaw, it would require a 2/3 majority in order to remove me, instead of a simple majority that they could do just through simply saying there was an issue with the election and then redoing it. And ultimately, when it came down to that, I decided not to run for re-election because we have bigger things to focus on right now than a ceremonial volunteer role at the DNC or a title there, when I'm going to do the work that I believe we need to do to win back young people, which is supporting people like Zoran.
Yeah, so I thought the bylaw debate was an interesting and legitimate one, and I might have agreed with Ken on that one, but I would have wanted to hear your side of it. And you're making a really interesting point about Tammy Duckworth and others having run PACs before as vice chairs. So that's a super good, legitimate debate. There's nothing wrong with having that debate, and the compromise you offered is an interesting one too.
Let me say this one other thing, Cenk, as well.
Yeah.
When I brought up, just for your audience's total awareness and your awareness as well, when I was in these conversations with the DNC and I talked to leadership and I said, okay, let me paint you a picture here. Let's say that this bylaw goes through and future president, I don't know, Gavin Newsom appoints Governor Westmore of Maryland to be a vice chair of the DNC. And Governor Westmore has a PAC that gives to an incumbent in a primary, right? Are you going to say to the president of the United States, I'm sorry, your friend Governor Westmore has just violated the DNC's bylaw, and we are now going to remove him by a 2/3 vote? And you know what the response that I got was I can't speculate on the future.
I mean, that's amazing, because that's
the thing,
that just
like, if we're going to be real about this,
yeah.
If we're going to be real about this, right? Let's make it an actually enforced rule and not just have this be a one-time thing. And when somebody tells me like, oh, I just can't speculate on the future, when I ask them whether or not this rule is going to be enforced, and they continue to insist on giving to groups like the DCCC and the DSCC that both famously get involved in primaries, and we are actively funding state parties that absolutely rig primaries in favor of certain candidates against other ones by pulling things like the voter file away from candidates challenging incumbents at times. And this is not all state parties, but there are some that do this. And I'm told there's just nothing we can do about that. It's hard for me to take it seriously.
Yeah, and they're not neutral in the presidential race either, the one they're supposed to be neutral on.
They should be.
Yeah, so they should be, but they're not. I mean, like, so I ran as a protest candidate against Biden to try to get other people to go in the race, et cetera. And to your point about North Dakota, I did the best in Oklahoma. So there's good progressives and populists everywhere, right? But no, they would pull the voter files, and then they wouldn't. In some states, they just don't put you on. They're like, so what? Right. We're cheating. What are you going to do about it? Okay.
And that is actual undue influence that should not be allowed, to be clear. But the problem that I had is that we're talking about whether or not officers are involved in primaries when the actual problem is when state parties are actively pulling resources away from candidates like the voter file and tilting the playing field in favor of their candidate. And we're supporting committees like the DTRIP and DS that actively are putting their thumb on the scale in primaries. That's what I'm a lot more concerned about than what just somebody in a symbolic voluntary role is doing. And if we're gonna talk about neutrality, let's actually make it a real policy that is enforced, where if you are a state party putting your thumb on the scale for a certain candidate, that you do not get funding from the DNC anymore. That if you were active, if we want to fund the DTRIP or the DS and give them money, we should give them that money after primaries are over if those committees are going to be involved in primaries, if we actually are serious about remaining neutral.
I couldn't agree more. That last point is absolutely critical. So look, to be fair to Ken Martin, he wasn't there when they were rigging things in 2016, 2020, or even 2024. And he actually did put my name on the Minnesota ballot when he had the authority in Minnesota. And I'll give him a lot of credit for that as well. So he was fair when he applied it that way. But what I was leading up to, David, is even if I agree with Ken on the bylaw issue, et cetera, when they then decided to do a second vote on this, like, oh, we have this rule, and oh, we are so concerned about this second rule we found against David Hogg, coincidentally, right? And now we're gonna do this vote and we're gonna oust them, but we would have done it otherwise. I was like, no, I don't believe you at all anymore. You're like, now they've lost all credibility. And it was obvious that they were targeting you. So why did they target you? Like, what do you think was the apparatus? Who was powerful enough, or maybe it's a collection of people that goes to Ken Martin and goes, no, we're done with this kid, right? And why did they do it? Who are they? And tell us how you think that worked.
You know, I think it's probably a combination of people who were, one, I think there were moderates that certainly actively were involved in that, because I've said things about, for example, abolishing ICE when I was 18 years old. That was something that was repeatedly, brought up to me as like, oh, you have to address this as some kind of problem. Granted, we're seeing what's happening with ICE now. And I think more than anything, it's, our party is an incumbent protection racket. Groups like the DTRIP are funded by members of Congress. They are incentivized to keep their members in their positions of power so they can continue raising that same money and protect them. And the problem with our party is that we say that we want to change, at least we claim to want to, but ultimately we don't want to fundamentally change who we are, because a lot of the leaders of our party are incentivized to keep the power structures the same, keep the people in their same positions of power, even if it is collectively detrimental to our party. Because it is a lot easier to just say, oh, we need to focus on our messaging, we got to change our messaging, than it is to say we need to change our messengers in the first place. And I think when I announced that we were going to be doing this work to challenge some Democratic incumbents in safer seats that we felt like were failing to meet the moment, people like Shri Thanadar, who it literally spent just about $1 million in taxpayer dollars on self-promotional ads, or voted for Trump's crypto grift bill, they were inherently threatened by that and conspired to make sure that I was not in that position of power anymore. And also took people with real legitimate arguments that truly, in good faith, like yourself, Cenk, that want the DNC to remain as neutral as possible, and got them on their side to say, look, we just got to get rid of this guy because this is a rule change that has to go through, and it's not going to be possible if he does this work. So I was put in a position where I was told I have to choose between either being essentially in a symbolic role at the DNC, or my values and my literal job, which is running Leaders We Deserve. And every time I'm of course going to have to choose my values and my job than a volunteer symbolic role.
Yeah. So last thing then, David, because you and I still have not given up on the Democratic Party, despite all of the faults and attacks against us personally, et cetera, right? But it appears to me, and of course I've thought this for a long time, but especially given what you're saying today, that the incumbents are the entrenched power, right? Mm-hmm. So and unfortunately, we are past the tipping point. The great majority of those incumbents got there through money in politics, right? Through massive PAC donations from corporations, people who support foreign governments, et cetera, right? So those guys are going to control the party. They are the party, right? So change from the inside, I think, is literally impossible because they've entrenched the power around the PAC donations, right? And all the lobbies, et cetera. So it seems to me that it's the only way to change the party is from the outside. That you have to go outside the party, primary incumbents, seize power, seize state parties, et cetera, and that there is no other way to do it other than that kind of rebellion or revolution within the Democratic Party.
Pretty much. I mean, look, I believe the reason why I ran to be a vice chair is because I believe in, instead of just saying, oh man, this car sucks, it's not gonna go anywhere, we gotta fix the car so we actually can go somewhere. And it's a lot harder to try to fix the car, to try to take the engine apart, to try to get the wheels spinning, everything like that. I wanted to try, at least, to say, you know what, I gave it a shot to try to fix it on the inside. And we saw what ended up happening, right? And of course, a lot of that is around disagreements around the neutrality in the DNC, which ultimately I think we're on the same side of. It's just a matter of the implementation of that policy and when it started and the precedent that we were setting of changing the bylaws after the election. But I think we have no other choice but to show the institutions and the incumbents that there is either you need to get your act together, or you're going to be defeated. And that's what we're trying to do at Leaders We Deserve with our friends over at Justice Democrats and a lot of our other partners as well, is to ensure that we are building a Democratic Party that is not just defined by telling people how we're just not Republicans and that's why you should vote for us. A party that is defined by the amount of harm that we don't do, but instead a party that is defined by the amount of good that we do, the amount of good governance that we do to make the government actually work and protect everyday Americans from special interests that are actively corrupting our government, taking over groups like the Democratic Party, where we say, in one of the briefings that we had at the DNC, one of the first things they're like, we can't take corporate money because we are a party and we're not allowed to take corporate money. And then you look at the FEC reports and you see the Employee Association for Lockheed Martin gave the DNC $10,000 or whatever it was. That's just right. It's going to have to be people from the outside that are not only better, but are significantly better than the incumbents, and repeatedly show that not only that doing the right thing is politically advantageous, and if you don't, and you're not on the right side of history of standing against these special interests, of standing against the oligarchs, of standing against groups that seek to just empower the people that are already powerful right now, instead of helping everyday people, that you're going to be defeated.
Yeah, look, what I would say to the audience as we part here is support Democratic policies, not politicians. So unfortunately, the politicians have lost their way, and they're not fighting for those policies at all, the current incumbents. Now, mind you, the people that David's supporting through Leaders We Deserve, I'm supporting through Rebellion PAC or any other thing that we're doing, or all the other wonderful organizations, progressive, left-wing, populist, whatever it might be, outsiders, change agents, please go support them, because that's still supporting the Democratic. In fact, that's in my opinion, David, it's the best way we can support the Democratic Party, not by blindly supporting their incumbents, whether they do our policies or they don't, but by supporting the policies and the people that are fighting for those policies from the outside. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's what we're trying to do at Leaders We Deserve. I think it's only going to be through ruthless competition in safe Democratic seats in our primaries that we're going to challenge ourselves to actually get better. If there's anything I learned from activism, it's that comfortable politicians don't change. And there are way too many comfortable people in our party right now who repeatedly talk about, oh my God, we're living in a fascist time and there's an authoritarian takeover, but certainly don't sound like it. Don't seem like they're actually fighting. And I think if they don't get their act together, they should be challenged. And we only stand to benefit from that at the end of the day. And if people want to support the work that we're doing, like you mentioned, to ensure that we have that independence to do this work and be driven by our principles and our mission, even when there are people who come to us that say, oh, you supported somebody like Zoran, I'm not going to support you anymore. The best way you can help us continue that work is by donating just like $5 a month, if you can, at leaderswedeserve.com.
All right, David Hogg, president of Leaders We Deserve. Thank you for joining us, brother. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.